Okay, so here we are with the Chapter 28 video lecture from Music History 2, Opera and Musical Theater in the later 19th century. So we've already talked about opera in the first half of the 1800s, bel canto, as well as Carl Maria von Weber, and the establishment of a Russian tradition of opera, as well as, of course, the French grand opera. So in the second half of the 1800s, we see that nationalism continued to grow. This is something we've already talked about quite extensively, I think, throughout the Romantic era. But nationalism in both music and art is something that continued to build and build. And it's actually a fairly straightforward thing to do musically, because what you're doing is you're finding melodies, harmonies, rhythms associated with whatever area you're from, be it Eastern Europe, be it Russia, be it England, or whatever. We've talked about this, especially vis-a-vis the music of Chopin, for example, the imitation of national dances and styles. But what's actually fairly straightforward in opera is that you can also begin to set legends or myths or national stories to music. The use of text, of course, and storytelling is a great advantage in that. So nationalism, obviously emphasizing your national characteristics, exoticism, evoking music from foreign lands or cultures from foreign lands. In the 1800s, other cultures began to open up more and more. For example, Japan in the mid-1800s for the first time was opened back up to the West in the 1850s. The music of, say, China was brought to Paris in the late 1800s, so people began to really become interested in these foreign cultures. So they would borrow melodic, harmonic conventions. It wasn't necessarily authentic or accurate. People didn't seem to really care about that. They just wanted to be transported to a foreign land, if you will. So, just like in concert music, a core repertoire is developing in opera. If an opera was popular, the public wanted to see it again. Multiple productions could be staged. The performing spaces got larger and larger, the concert halls, or the opera houses, so they could sell more. Just like in concert music, the orchestras got larger, got louder, so the singers had to train in such a way that they could project to these larger spaces over larger orchestras. And composers also dealt with this by making melodies more syllabic, because syllabic is more easily understood and more easily projected than opposed to long melismatic passages. So we're going to basically break this down primarily into Wagner and the Italian composers. So we start with Richard Wagner. Wagner is the most written about musician in history. He did amazing things musically. He was progressive with harmony to the point that people still argue about his music today from a harmonic perspective. He reinvented opera in a completely new sense, into something which he called the music drama, his rich chromatic idiom. He pushed harmony to the point that eventually some other German composers like Strauss and Mahler, and then ultimately Linda Schoenberg, said that tonalism or tonal music has gone as far as it can. Eventually led to atonal music. He was a very powerful personality. He had people who supported him financially, including the young King Ludwig II of Bavaria, who was nicknamed the Mad King, but he was a big help to Wagner financially. We've talked about how many people view opera as the height of art because it fuses instrumental music and vocal music and the written word through the libretto and dance and visual arts through the costuming and through the sets and all that. Well, Wagner really believed in this concept of total or collective artwork, which basically meant that all of these different elements were fused together and worked absolutely seamlessly together. So what this led for him was to a new imagining of the opera, which he called music drama. Wagner wrote his own librettos in addition to writing the music because he wanted everything to work exactly hand in hand. He was very much a control freak when it came to his operas. In addition to this, to writing music, of course, he did write essays and things like that. Now, here's the thing about Wagner. Wagner was not a nice person. He was a genius of a musician. Even today, he's considered to be one of the all-time geniuses of musicians. But he was actually quite a terrible human being. One of the things that he is most known for today is he was anti-Semitic. He was very much had a problem with Jewish people, with Jewish culture, with the Jewish religion in general. He even wrote an essay called Jewishness in Music, in which he went after both Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer, who were actually composers that he admired, but he attacked them just for being Jewish. This eventually led, by the way, to, in the 1900s, the Nazi Party were also obviously very anti-Semitic. That was one of the cornerstones of the Nazi Party. And Wagner was adopted as the official composer of the Nazis. Now, he was long dead by then. He had been dead for 40 years before Hitler came around, before the rise of Hitler began. But Wagner's music was a real inspiration to the Nazis. Not just because of his anti-Semitism, but also because Wagner was very much an ardent German nationalist, which what the Nazis believed what they were doing was German nationalism. So, Wagner's early operas, Rienzi, composed when he was 29 years old. It's a grand opera, very much influenced by French grand opera. The Flying Dutchman, a almost direct successor to Carl Maria von Weber's operas. It's based on a legend, on a Dutch legend. Tannhauser, again, based on German legend, in this case, German national legend, and Lohengrin. These are considered to be his four early operas, and they're all in the core repertoire today. Every one of these operas, as a matter of fact, I've seen Flying Dutchman and Lohengrin performed by the Metropolitan Opera. So, even though these are his early operas, composed when he was in his late 20s into his 30s, they are all considered to be in the core repertoire. Not just the operas themselves, but the overtures, the Overture to Flying Dutchman, Overture to Rienzi, the Fest music from Tannhauser, the preludes from the different acts of Lohengrin. These are all mainstays in the concert hall as well. So, his early operas made him well known and successful. But what has made Wagner a legend, a musical legend, was this amazing conception that he had for an operatic cycle. Now, a song cycle, difficult enough to write 10, 15 art songs that are all linked together by a topic, totaling maybe 30 minutes of music. Wagner conceived of an operatic cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen, the Ring of the Nibelung, which is 4 operas, around 16 hours of music, depending on how fast you conduct them. They're all based on German and Norse legends. As a matter of fact, one of the original books they have in a museum in Iceland, which has these legends. The 4 operas, there are 4 operas total. Das Rheingold, which translates as the Rheingold, Die Valkyrie, Siegfried, which is the name of the hero, and Götterdämmerung, which translates as the Twilight of the Gods. These 4 operas are based around the story of a magic ring. The same mythologies that Wagner accessed to write The Ring of the Nibelung, British writer named J.R.R. Tolkien in the early 20th century used these same mythologies to compose the Lord, or to write, rather, the Lord of the Rings, if you're familiar with those books or the movies they made out of those books. There are some similarities in the stories, although not as many as you might think. Wagner built his own theater in Bayreuth, in Bavaria, in Germany. This was actually financed by King Ludwig II. The first performance of the ring cycle, complete ring cycle, was given there in 1876. I'll show these, remind me in class, I'll show these pictures to you so you can see them more clearly. This is a drawing of the Bayreuth Festspielhaus, or Festival House. This is as it looks today. What makes it particularly fascinating is the pit. Wagner wrote for a huge orchestra, 90, 100 players for his later operas, for the Ring Cycle operas specifically. The pit is actually stair-stepped down so that the loudest instruments, the brass and the percussion, are all the way down at the bottom, way underneath behind the stage level, so that it kind of serves as a natural mute to them. Whereas as you go up the steps, then you get your woodwinds, your harps, your strings, and then the conductor, and then there's a little shield here so the audience never sees the conductor, but the conductor is visible from the stage. So it's almost naturally built acoustically to make the instruments balance. Because he wrote, as I said, he wrote for a huge orchestra, but he didn't want the orchestra drowning out the singers. Obviously in the 1800s, long before any kind of amplification could have possibly been used. I'll show you this picture again. This is actually a picture of the pit. Conductor's up here. Here's the front apron of the stage, and the orchestra works their way all the way down. So in addition to Wagner's fame for just developing the Ring and the Nibelung, one thing that probably makes this as important as anything was his development of a concept called the Leitmotif, or leading motive. This is essentially a taking of Hector Berlioz's idea of the idée fixe from Symphonie Fantastique and developing it into a much, much more comprehensive thought. So Leitmotif is a musical theme. It's an idea, could be short, could be a little longer, which is specifically identified with a person or a place, or it could be an object. Almost every person of note and every place of importance, and even certain objects like Wotan's spear or Siegfried's sword, have their own theme music, have their own leitmotif. So what he does is he builds the music around these motifs. Anytime someone comes on stage, or if someone is talked about by people who are on stage, or if an object is referred to or a place is referred to, the orchestra and or the singers perform the music is the theme music for that person, place, or thing. So it's theoretically possible to follow all the action in the entire Ring cycle without ever actually having anyone sing. As a matter of fact, people have done that. They've done things they call symphonic synthesis, where they take all the music from these operas and they basically tell the story of the operas with only the instrumental music, with no voices. If you know what the leitmotifs are, that each one, oh, that's Brunhilde, that's Siegfried, that's the sword, that's Valhalla, then you can follow the action. You know what's happening more or less just based on the instrumental music. It's incredibly comprehensive, and it's actually incredibly popular today. Those are some leitmotifs. Well, in class, we're going to spend a lot of time on Wagner's operas. We're going to break down his leitmotifs. We're going to do some analysis of his orchestration, and we're going to do some analysis of Tristan and Isolde. I'll get that in a moment. So we've talked about the idea of contemporary incidental music as movie music. Well, movie composers make greater use of leitmotifs than anyone else. Other composers have been influenced by the concept. Puccini, the opera composer, used leitmotifs, influenced by Wagner. But John Williams, the great movie composer, many of his characters have their own themes. The shark in Jaws has its own theme. Darth Vader has his own theme, the Imperial March. Hedwig in the Harry Potter movies has its own theme, his own theme, I suppose. So movie composers make great use of leitmotifs as well. So while he was working on the Ring cycle, you can see, going all the way back, the Ring cycle was completed in 1876, was when the first complete performance was given. He worked on it over a couple of decades. During this time, though, he was also working on other operas as well. Tristan and Isolde, written, took him 3 years, completed in 1859. Again, based on a German, in this case, a German romance from the 1200s, is incredibly influential harmonically. The prelude is a series of dissonances that never really resolve, and then he sequences that. To this day, people really argue about what the function of these chords are. The chords themselves are not amazingly unusual. What's unusual is the function of these chords, the fact that we don't get a very straightforward 1-4-5-1 or something like that happening. We'll break that down in class quite thoroughly. That's why it's so influential. He also wrote the Meistersinger, which is about a singing contest in medieval Germany, and Parsifal, based on the legend of the Holy Grail. He completed that in 1882. Wagner died in 1883. All of these operas are in the core repertoire. However, they're all difficult to stage, especially the later operas call for a large cast. They're very long. His operas are 4 or 5 hours long. As a matter of fact, the first opera I ever saw at the Metropolitan Opera House was Parsifal, and that's a 5-hour plus opera. But I mean, it was an incredible opera, an incredible experience seeing it live, that I kind of lost track of the fact that I was there for 5 hours, which I guess is the sign of great music, of a great opera. So large casts, huge orchestras, very lengthy and frequently large and complicated sets. So these are not the easiest operas to stage. So while they're all in the core repertoire, they don't get performed with the frequency of, say, Mozart's middle operas or Verdi's operas or anything like that. The prelude, just talked about this from Tristan and Isolde. We'll break this down in class. The very first chord has actually been nicknamed the Tristan chord. It's that identifiable, and basically it's a dissonance resolving to a dissonance, resolving to a dissonance, resolving to a dissonance. He really totally set the stage for the 20th century in the complete abolition of harmony. So, why is Wagner so important? His influence has been felt as a dominant opera composer pretty much from his early days. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's more written about Wagner than any other composer. Literally, more books, more essays, more articles about Wagner's music than anyone else, including Beethoven. His concept of this total artwork. Oh, one other thing about Wagner's music dramas I think I forgot to mention. Almost every opera ever written follows a very straightforward formula. You have a recitative, you have an aria. At the end of the aria, there's a big complete cadence, and there's a break. Everyone stops playing, stops singing, and the audience gets to clap, 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 clap. And if it's someone famous who just sang a famous aria, like when Pavarotti would sing Nessun Dorma, people might throw flowers up on stage and things like that. Wagner did away with all that. There are no breaks. The music segues straight through. There are no spots where you can stop and applaud the person who just sang the aria, because that aria is already transitioned into the next scene. The orchestra plays almost non-stop in a Wagner opera. Their only breaks are the intermissions between acts. So his concepts influenced many people. His use of leitmotifs, imitated by many composers, talked about that. Unfortunately, his anti-Semitism also was influential. Not that he was the only anti-Semitic person out there. As a matter of fact, I'm reading a book right now, it's about the nuclear scientists in the 20th century that invented the atomic bomb. But it starts with Jewish people fleeing Europe and coming to the United States in the 1800s, and how they encountered anti-Semitism here as well. Anti-Semitism is a long-established thing. Wagner didn't invent it, but he certainly was involved in it. So, Wagner, in the second half of the 1800s, Wagner is German opera. In Italy, we have probably the most popular opera composer that there is. If it's not Verdi, it's Puccini. If it's not one of those two, then it might be Mozart. But Verdi, absolutely dominant. After Donizetti, Verdi was the most important Italian opera composer. He wrote 26 operas total. He retired, and then he came back and actually wrote 2 of his greatest operas after his first retirement. Why is Verdi so popular? Well, for a couple reasons. First of all, his melodies are absolutely beautiful. Singers love to sing them. Audiences love to hear them. They're very idiomatic, and they're very easy to listen to, is a good way to put it. I won't say they're easy to sing, because they can be quite challenging, but they're very easy to listen to and to identify with. Aside from that, his stories. Verdi had a great sense of picking a good story. He liked to pick stories that he knew were already good stories. This is why he set operas out of Shakespeare plays, had a librettist who would take a Shakespeare play, turn it into an opera. And Victor Hugo, who wrote The Hunchback of Notre Dame, among many other things, and Schiller, who wrote the Ode to Joy that Beethoven set in his Ninth Symphony. So he took already successful playwrights, novelists, and poets. He chose them for his librettos, to turn their work into librettos, because he knew they were good stories. What was good about it? A lot of action, a lot of emotional contrasts, characters that people would remember, very memorable characters, and situations that people would feel invested in. Be it a woman who falls in love with a man, although the man is a womanizer and is going to treat her badly, and things of that nature, or if you, the jealousy, he took Othello by Shakespeare and created an opera out of Othello and the insane jealousy that you see in Othello. So he had a very good eye for a story, and this is why he was so popular, not just the music, but his ability to pick a story. His first opera, which was a huge hit, Nabucco, in 1842, kind of launched Verdi. He was 29. Oddly enough, the same age that Wagner was when his first opera was successful. Louisa Miller, Rigoletto in 1851, kind of out of all these, Rigoletto, La Traviata, Il Trovatore, to a lesser degree, these things are absolutely in the core repertoire. Everything Verdi wrote is in the core repertoire, really. I think in class we'll give a listen to something from Rigoletto. La Traviata is an incredibly popular opera. It's actually the first opera I played at the Kennedy Center, if I remember correctly. Moving forward, Sicilian Vespers, he adopted kind of the French grand opera model, kind of being experimental. Masked Ball, comic opera. Aida takes place in Egypt. So, an Italian opera written that it takes place in Egypt makes it exoticism, very much exoticism. It was commissioned by the Cairo Opera in Egypt, and it's very popular. That one's difficult to stage because you've got, depends on how far you want to go, you could have elephants on stage, and there's a scene where you have like 20 trumpeters on stage, so that's not an easy one to stage. Verdi retired in 1871. I believe his wife had died, and he just kind of wanted to move on. But about 16 years later, Verdi was talked out of retirement. And when he was around 80 years old, well, he wrote Falstaff when he was 80, he wrote Othello when he was 70, just a spring chicken of 74. He wrote two of his greatest operas of all, both on Shakespeare, Othello, and Falstaff. Falstaff is an opera buffa, a comic opera, based on the character Sir John Falstaff, who appears in two different Shakespeare plays. His librettist, Argo Boito, was actually also a composer, who composed an opera called Mephistopheles, which is in the rep, which has been performed, and that's based on Goethe's Faust. There's Goethe's Faust again, you can't get away from it. Verdi was amazingly popular in his lifetime. His operas were so popular that, well, he could retire, fairly early, retired before he was 60. In the 1850s, his operas were performed more than anyone else's operas. In the 20th century, his operas have become the core of the repertoire. If you think of the operatic repertoire as being a three-legged stool, those three legs are Verdi, Puccini, and Mozart, in my opinion. More of his operas are in the permanent repertoire than anyone else, and they continue to be this popular to this day, and many of them have actually, they've made movies out of these operas as well. I mean, heck, one of the stories about how popular Verdi was and how he could write a tune was in Rigoletto. He wrote an aria called La Donna Mobile, which he knew was going to be a hit. He knew that as soon as they gave the world premiere, that it would get out, and that every gondolier in Venice, it was premiered in Venice, and in Venice, Italy, there are no streets, it's canals, and the taxis are water taxis, and even to this day, because it's kind of a fun tourist tradition, you can get pulled through in gondolas, these long, thin boats, and the gondolier stands up there and pulls you through the streets, and the gondoliers sing. They sing popular songs. He knew as soon as Rigoletto premiered that every gondolier in Venice was going to be singing La Donna Mobile, so he actually kept the aria secret. He didn't even show it to the tenor who was going to be performing it until the day of the performance, because he didn't want it to leak, and he didn't want every gondolier in Venice singing it before the opera had even premiered. But that's a great example of how Verdi's popularity was in the mid-1800s, and he knew it was that popular. Okay, moving on in Italy. A movement came along which worked in parallel with this movement in literature for more realistic, it was called realism, is for more realistic plots, more identifiable characters, and this is known as verismo, which basically just means realism. Everyday people, generally lower class people, instead of making operas to glorify the nobility, these are operas about the struggles of the poor. The two kind of cornerstone operas from this are Rustic Chivalry by Mascagni and Pagliacci by Leoncavallo. If there are two operatic stereotypes, more so than any other operatic stereotypes, they are the Valkyrie, the woman with a helmet with the horns on it, and the spear, singing in a Wagner opera, Brunhilde, and the sad clown from Pagliacci. Pagliacci, I mean the lead character, is a tragic opera and is a clown, is a sad clown. Those are probably the two greatest operatic stereotypes there are, the sad clown and the Valkyrie. So the last of these great Romantic Italian opera composers is Puccini. As you can see, he bridged into the 20th century. He died in 1924. He is the most successful Italian opera composer after Verdi, and heck, there might be a competition to see whose operas get performed more. Probably Verdi, but Puccini's, his most popular operas are maybe the most popular operas in the standard repertoire of all. He's an interesting composer because he had the beautiful Italian vocal approach of Verdi. He was very influenced by Wagner's harmonies, and he also adopted Wagner's use of leitmotifs. In addition to that, his operas are very much based in verismo. Even beyond that, his operas are very much based in exoticism. Some of his operas are very much a part of the Romantic movement of exoticism. So, his third opera, Manon Lescaut, in 1893, was a huge hit and made him internationally famous, which led to La Bohème, maybe the most popular opera in all the repertoire. So popular that in about 20 years ago, people decided to readapt it and turn it into the musical Rent. But if you see the musical Rent, open the program, it actually says libretto by Puccini. Puccini also wrote his own libretti, by the way. Tosca, hugely popular opera. If you've seen the new James Bond movies, the one that starred Daniel Craig, I think it's in the second one of those, there's a scene that takes place at an opera house and they're performing Tosca. The Girl of the Golden West takes place in the California Gold Rush. What do we call it? When an Italian composer writes an Italian opera, but it's based in America, well, we call that exoticism. Just like Madame Butterfly, which was based in Japan around 1900. Another opera that was so popular and the story was so compelling that in the 1990s, some people adapted it into the musical Miss Saigon. It's about a soldier, Navy sailor actually, who's based in Japan, and he falls in love, a woman falls in love with him, her family doesn't want her to get married to him because of tradition, and they know that he's eventually going to leave. Well, they adapted it into Miss Saigon, this time with an American serviceman in Vietnam. And then Turandot, which takes place in China. Exoticism, exoticism, exoticism. So, what made Puccini's operas great? Well, the vocal melodic approach of Verdi. Wagner's approach of leitmotifs, freed up from the traditional recitative aria, pause for applause kind of form. He was freer with his forms. The orchestra in Puccini actually plays a very important supporting role, just like Wagner. In Wagner, the orchestra is an integral part to the music, part of that collective artwork. It is so in Puccini also. I know people, I've studied with members of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra. Without a doubt, I think all of them, if you ask them what composer do they enjoy playing in the pit, Puccini is probably it. The continuous flow of action just like Wagner, like we talked about. So in class, we will listen to Act 1 of Madame Butterfly, which kind of shows us how we blur between the aria and the recitative. Now the music moves seamlessly forward. So that's something we'll break down extensively in class. Other stage stuff going on in the second half of the 1800s. Ballet. Ballet had been around for a while, and actually in French grand opera, the ballet, or extensive dance scenes, has always been at the heart of French grand opera. But in the mid-1800s, ballet begins to develop as a completely separate genre. The most important of these composers is Leo Delibes, who composed Coppelia and Sylvia, both of which absolutely at the heart of the repertoire for ballet companies. Also in France, Gounod, Charles Gounod, was writing opera. Faust, hey, where's Faust from? Of course, he reset Goethe's Faust, who didn't. He also wrote Romeo and Juliet, and Massenet was writing lyric operas as well in France. Manon, Werther, and Thais, all of which are very popular to this day. So, at the same time that Wagner is doing his thing in Germany, and that Verdi succeeded by Puccini are doing their thing, in France, probably the most popular opera composers whose works are in the standard rep are Gounod and Massenet. Except for the king of all, who is Bizet. Bizet was successful as an instrumental composer. His symphony in C is very popular. His ballet music, L'Arlésienne, the girl from Arles, very popular today. But kind of his crowning achievement was the opera Carmen. Now, Carmen takes place in Spain. So it's a French composer writing music takes place in Spain, so it's exoticism. However, it's realism. It focuses on the problems of the poor, lower class in Spain, which also makes it, to some degree, verismo. It's a fun opera. It's brilliant. There's murder in it. There's sex in it. The melodies are incredibly influential. As a matter of fact, maybe I'll do this in class. I could probably play half a dozen just melodies from Carmen for you, and you would instantly recognize them. Also happening in France at the same time as Bizet and Gounod and Massenet, there was opera bouffe, or comic opera, happening. And I just want to kind of, not buffet, I just kind of wanted to mention this because the Can-Can from Orpheus in the Underworld by Jacques Offenbach is one of the most played pieces of music ever written. It's a ballet that takes place it's a dance scene that takes place during his comic opera, Orpheus in the Underworld. Think all the way back to last semester. This is the same Greek story, same Greek myth that was set by Monteverdi, and of course before that by Jacopo Peri and others throughout history. Well, Offenbach turned it into a comic opera. So he was actually very influential, and his music is played today quite frequently. In Russia, we have Tchaikovsky. Now, we'll talk about Tchaikovsky more in the next chapter. But the thing about Tchaikovsky was he was an instrumental composer. He was also an opera composer. He also wrote songs. He also wrote ballets. So it's a good argument if you were going to say that what is Tchaikovsky best known for? He might be best known for his ballets. But he went to law school, but he always wanted to be a musician. So after he enrolled in a government job, he actually started at St. Petersburg Conservatory and eventually wound up teaching at the Moscow Conservatory. He was a very successful professional, but he was a very unhappy man for a number of different reasons. Tchaikovsky was homosexual in Russia in the 1800s when that was punishable by death, imprisonment or death, so he kept it secret. He even staged, he married one of his students in an attempt to kind of throw off suspicion. That ended very unhappily after just a few weeks. He attempted to commit suicide, did not successfully commit suicide, tried to drown himself. Tchaikovsky is very famous for having a patron, Nadia von Meck, who was a very wealthy widow who supported Tchaikovsky financially. She sent him money They corresponded. There are many, many letters between the two over the years, which really gives us a clear view into Tchaikovsky's mental state during these times. They never actually met face to face. It's really quite fascinating. Something that made Tchaikovsky very interesting as a composer, and maybe what made him so successful, was during this time in Russia, we have the mighty handful. We have the Russian Five, those composers who built on the works of Glinka and were attempting to create music that sounded very Russian, using Russian harmonies and melodies and themes. Tchaikovsky was very influenced by them to some degree, but also by Western musicians, by the great composers from Germany and France and Italy. So he attempted to fuse the compositional structure and style of the great European composers with Russian nationalism. The nationalists didn't particularly like his music because of this, but Tchaikovsky became far more popular than any other Russian composers, not even a close second for Tchaikovsky. Now, in the next chapter, we will talk about his symphonies and his tone poems. In this chapter, we're going to specifically talk about his stage work. So he wrote 8 operas, wrote 3 ballets, 6 symphonies, 2 piano concertos, a violin concerto, standard rep, symphonic poems, one of which, his Romeo and Juliet, is as much of a musical archetype as has ever been written, chamber music and songs. But of his 8 operas, 2 of them are performed with great frequency, Queen of Spades and Eugene Onegin. These are in the core of the rep for opera companies. His ballets are the most popular ballets ever written. They're danced right now, even as I speak, right now at 4:20, someone somewhere is dancing a Tchaikovsky ballet. It's 5 hours later in Europe, so it's 9:20. They're in the middle of, or they've just started Act 2 in a Tchaikovsky ballet somewhere in Europe. Not just one place, maybe dozens of places. Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella's another ballet he wrote actually, which he'll talk about in the text. And The Nutcracker. The Nutcracker takes place, it's based on a story by E.T.A. Hoffman, I believe, and it takes place at Christmas, so The Nutcracker is traditionally performed at Christmas time. You know, because every December we have the Delaware Ballet here basically taking over our wing of the building for a week. Little kids running around performing The Nutcracker. Swan Lake, we'll watch a scene from Swan Lake in class. Very, very famous music. So, the Mighty Five. Balakirev, Borodin, Cesar Quay, Mussorgsky, and Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. As I've already mentioned, these are 5 Russian composers who tried to pick up the mantle from Glinka, who I talked about in chapter 27, and move forward with a true Russian national music. They didn't like the formal music study that was happening in conservatories, because the conservatories were teaching Russian composers how to sound like Beethoven or Mendelssohn. They wanted composers to sound Russian. It's remarkably similar to something that happens just maybe 3-4 decades later in America. Balakirev is only one of them who studied in more of the traditional sense. Most of them had day jobs. Rimsky-Korsakov was a lieutenant in the Navy before he actually started teaching at St. Petersburg Conservatory. Mussorgsky was a government clerk. Borodin was a chemist. So they all had jobs in addition to composing music. As I've already said, Russian music has its own unique scales, its own unique properties to the melody and harmonic content, and they really try to take advantage of that. So of these composers, the most successful of those 5 is Rimsky-Korsakov. His stage works and symphonic works are incredibly popular, but Mussorgsky has also had a very successful life after his death, if you will. His main stage works, Boris Godunov is very much a part of the standard rep. So much so that if you've ever seen the old Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoons, the bad guy, the Russian bad guy, is named Boris Badunov. Obviously a direct pun on Boris Godunov. Rimsky-Korsakov studied with Balakirev, went into the Navy, and then, after he got out of the Navy, he became a professor at St. Petersburg Conservatory, as I said, where he freely admits in his first couple of years he stayed 1 class ahead or one chapter ahead of the class in the textbook, trying to learn a more formal way of doing things. He's an incredibly important composer, known as a brilliant orchestrator, able to create amazing colors out of the orchestra. And his students, Glazunov, who became the head of the St. Petersburg Conservatory, and Stravinsky was a student of Rimsky-Korsakov as well. In Bohemia, which today we think of as the Czech Republic, Smetana was a great nationalist composer who we'll talk about more in chapter 29 with his composition The Moldau. But he created a Czech style of Czech opera based in the folk songs, folk music of Bohemia, and also some of these legends. The Bartered Bride, which he wrote in 1866, is based on an old Bohemian folk tale. So Smetana, very important composer. As you can see, he died at age 60. He's another of the composers of the 1800s who died of syphilis. That woke you up, didn't it? Also going on, we mentioned comic opera happening to some degree in Italy and in France, and we've discussed comic opera last semester. The development of comic opera, Singspiel, ballad opera, and things like that. A new form of musical theater came about called operetta. Operetta is a step away from opera, closer to contemporary musicals. Contemporary musicals really came out of operetta. It's essentially, it's opera, it's comic opera, has spoken dialogue instead of recitative, so kind of comes out of the tradition of Singspiel and ballad opera there. Also, it tends to be more musically complex than contemporary musicals, but the music is definitely lighter and simpler than a lot of the operas that were being written in the time. Johann Strauss, the younger, his father, he also had a father named Johann Strauss, Sr. So Johann Strauss Jr., or known as the younger, was one of the great composers for operettas. In his opera, The Fledermaus, which is a flying mouse, which we translate as the bat, very popular, performed all over the world today. In England, Gilbert and Sullivan were writing operettas, including HMS Pinafore, Pirates of Penzance, and The Mikado, incredibly popular today. Gilbert and Sullivan's operettas are being performed right now. Even as we speak, Gilbert and Sullivan is being performed somewhere. Okay, that's a lot of information in that particular, this particular lecture. There's an online quiz that you'll have to take, and then we're going to take as much time as we need over the course of a couple classes to break down all this music from Wagner to Gilbert and Sullivan.